World War II produced some of the most extraordinary fighter pilots in human history. Men who flew into combat outnumbered, outgunned, and sometimes on fire, and came back anyway. In this video, we're counting down the 5 greatest American fighter pilots of the Second World War. Men whose names deserve to be remembered. Men whose stories are almost too extraordinary to believe. But before we start, a warning. Number 1 on this list is not who you expect. He didn't have the most kills. He wasn't the most decorated. By the numbers alone, he doesn't even come close to the men below him on this list. And yet, ask any American combat pilot who the greatest was. Ask the men who flew with him, fought beside him, studied his tactics for decades after the war. They'll give you the same answer every time. By the end of this video, you'll understand why. 5 pilots, 5 extraordinary stories. One list that might just change how you think about what it means to be the best. Let's start at number 5.
Number 5 on our list is a man who holds a record that has never been broken. Not in Korea, not in Vietnam, not in any conflict the United States has fought since 1945. Richard Bong is the highest-scoring American fighter ace in the history of the United States military. 40 confirmed aerial victories. He was 24 years old when the war ended. Richard Ira Bong was born on September 24, 1920 in Poplar, Wisconsin, a small town, a quiet life, the kind of place where nobody expects a future legend to come from. He was the oldest of 9 children, raised on a farm, and by every account a completely ordinary young man. Shy, polite, modest to a fault. His neighbors remembered him as the kind of kid who helped with chores without being asked and never had much to say about himself. But from the moment Richard Bong climbed into a cockpit, something changed. He had a natural gift for flying that his instructors had rarely seen, an instinctive understanding of 3-dimensional space, of angles and speed and timing that couldn't be taught in any classroom. He simply felt the aircraft in a way that other pilots spent careers trying to develop. He earned his wings in 1942 and was assigned to the Pacific Theater, flying the P-38 Lightning, a distinctive twin-engine, twin-boom fighter that would become inseparable from his legend. The P-38 was not the most maneuverable fighter of the war. In a turning dogfight against a nimble Japanese Zero, it was at a disadvantage. But it was fast. It had an extraordinary range, and in the hands of a pilot who understood how to use its strengths, who knew when to attack and when to disengage, it was devastatingly effective. Bong understood this better than almost anyone. His approach to aerial combat was methodical and almost cold-blooded in its precision. He didn't get into turning fights with Japanese fighters. He used the P-38's speed and altitude advantage to choose his moment, dive on his target, fire at close range, and break away before the enemy could respond. He made it look easy. His fellow pilots watched him work and struggled to explain what they were seeing. It wasn't recklessness, it wasn't aggression. It was something closer to perfect clarity, an ability to see the entire battle unfolding around him and always be exactly where he needed to be. By the end of 1943, Bong had 21 confirmed victories and was already the leading American ace of the war. General Douglas MacArthur personally awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross. When Bong reached 27 victories, breaking Eddie Rickenbacker's record from World War I that had stood for 25 years, MacArthur pinned the Medal of Honor on his chest in a ceremony in the Pacific. MacArthur called him the greatest fighter pilot in the history of American arms. Bong stood there quietly, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention, and thanked the general politely.
That was Richard Bong. As his score climbed through the 30s, commanders back in Washington began to get nervous. Bong was becoming too valuable, too famous, too important as a symbol to risk losing in combat. He was sent home twice for rest and public relations tours, making appearances across the country, meeting with the press, selling war bonds. He hated every minute of it. He wanted to be back in the Pacific, flying, and each time he went back. His final victory came in December 1944, bringing his total to 40. Shortly after, he was ordered home permanently. The military had decided that America's top ace had done enough. It was time to bring him back before the war took him.
And here is where Richard Bong's story takes the turn that makes it impossible to forget. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The war in the Pacific was clearly approaching its final phase. Richard Bong was in California, working as a test pilot for Lockheed, flying the new P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Richard Bong climbed into a P-80 for a routine test flight over Burbank, California. The engine failed shortly after takeoff. Bong attempted to bail out but was too low to the ground. He was killed on impact. He was 24 years old. The man who had survived 40 aerial victories over the Pacific, who had been shot at by some of the finest fighter pilots Japan ever produced, who had been sent home twice specifically because the military couldn't afford to lose him, died on a test flight over California, 8 days before Japan surrendered. Richard Bong never knew the war he had given everything to fight was about to end. He was buried in Poplar, Wisconsin, in the same quiet town where he had grown up. Flags flew at half-staff across the state. General MacArthur issued a statement calling his death a loss to the nation beyond measure. America's greatest ace was gone. And the record he set that summer, 40 confirmed aerial victories, has never been matched by any American pilot in any war since.
Number 4 on our list is a man who spent most of the war chasing the pilot we just told you about, and in many ways that chase defined and ultimately ended his life. Thomas Buchanan Maguire Jr. was born on August 1, 1920 in Ridgewood, New Jersey. Unlike the quiet, modest Richard Bong, Maguire was intense, competitive, and driven from an early age. He was the kind of person who kept score, who noticed when someone else was ahead of him, who could not, under any circumstances, accept being second best. Those qualities would make him one of the most effective fighter pilots of the entire war. They would also kill him. Maguire grew up in a complicated household. His parents divorced when he was young, and he was raised largely by his mother and stepfather in Sebring, Florida. He was a bright student, enrolled at Georgia Tech to study aeronautical engineering, but left before graduating to join the Army Air Forces. He earned his wings in February 1942 and was eventually assigned to the Pacific Theater, flying, like Bong, the P-38 Lightning. From the moment Maguire arrived in the Pacific, his competitiveness was obvious to everyone around him. He flew constantly, he volunteered for extra missions, he studied aerial combat tactics with an intensity that bordered on obsession. While other pilots rested between missions, Maguire was reviewing his engagements, identifying what he had done wrong, figuring out how to do it better next time. And he was extraordinarily good. His situational awareness in the air was exceptional. He had an ability to track multiple aircraft simultaneously, to know where every plane in the fight was, what it was doing, and where it was going, that gave him a decisive advantage in the chaos of a dogfight. By late 1944, Maguire had accumulated 31 confirmed victories and was closing in on Bong's record with remarkable speed. The rivalry between the two men was real, though it played out in a distinctly American way. They weren't enemies. By most accounts, they respected each other. But the competition was always there, unspoken and impossible to ignore, especially for Maguire, who watched Bong's score climb and felt the gap closing and then widening again like a wound that wouldn't heal. In December 1944, when Bong reached 40 victories and was sent home permanently, Maguire had 38, 2 victories behind. The record was right there. And now Bong was gone, back in the United States, safe, finished. If Maguire could get 2 more kills, he would tie the greatest ace in American history. 3 more and he would stand alone. He just needed a little more time.
On January 7, 1945, Maguire led a volunteer mission over the Philippines, a long-range fighter sweep designed to catch Japanese aircraft on the ground and in the air. He had 38 victories. He was so close to the record he could feel it. What happened next has been analyzed and debated by military historians for decades. Maguire's flight of 4 P-38s encountered a single Japanese fighter, a K-43 Hayabusa, flown by Sergeant Akira Sadamoto. A good pilot, but outnumbered 4-1. By any objective assessment, it should not have been a dangerous situation. But Maguire did something that morning that he had specifically warned his own pilots never to do.
In his eagerness to score, he dropped his external fuel tanks to increase maneuverability, and in doing so, committed himself to a low-altitude turning fight in a P-38, exactly the kind of engagement the aircraft was worst suited for. He had broken his own rules. The P-38 stalled in a hard turn at low altitude. Thomas Maguire had no room to recover. He was killed on impact with the jungle floor of the Philippine island of Negros. He was 24 years old, the same age as Richard Bong. He never got those 2 victories. He never got the record. In the weeks that followed, the United States Army Air Forces awarded Thomas Maguire the Medal of Honor, posthumously, like so many medals of that war. The citation described his extraordinary courage, his combat record, and the selfless leadership he had shown throughout his career in the Pacific. What the citation didn't say, what nobody said officially, was that he had died chasing a number. That is perhaps the most human thing about Thomas Maguire's story. He was not reckless in general. He was one of the most technically proficient and tactically disciplined pilots in the entire Pacific theater. He had briefed his own men on exactly the mistake he ended up making. But on that morning in January 1945, with the record 2 kills away and the war nearly over, something in Thomas Maguire overrode everything he knew. He had spent 3 years being second, and he couldn't do it anymore. 38 victories, second highest in American history, a Medal of Honor, a distinguished career by any measure. But for Thomas Maguire, second place was never going to be enough. And in the end, that was the most honest thing about him.
Number 3 on our list is the most unlikely hero you will ever hear about. He was a drunk, he was insubordinate, he owed money to half the people he knew. He had been thrown out of one military organization before the war even started, and spent most of his career one bad decision away from a court-martial. He was also one of the most gifted natural fighter pilots who ever lived, and the men who flew under his command would have followed him anywhere. Gregory Boyington was born on December 4, 1912 in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. His childhood was difficult from the start. His parents separated early, and he was raised believing his stepfather was his biological father, a fact he wouldn't discover until much later in life. He was smart, physically tough, and chronically self-destructive in ways that would follow him for decades. He wrestled in college, studied aeronautical engineering, joined the Marine Corps, and earned his wings in 1937. By all accounts, he was a superb pilot from the very beginning. His instructors recognized his talent immediately. His superiors recognized something else. Boyington drank heavily, fought frequently, accumulated debts he couldn't pay, and had a gift for making enemies among the people who outranked him. By 1941, his Marine Corps career was effectively stalled. He was going nowhere, owed back child support, and had run out of options. So he did what desperate men sometimes do. He took a gamble. In 1941, before the United States entered the war, a private organization was recruiting American pilots to fly for China against Japan, the American Volunteer Group, better known to history as the Flying Tigers. The pay was good, the adventure was real, and most importantly for Boyington, it was a way out. He resigned his Marine commission, joined the Flying Tigers, and shipped out to Asia. His time with the Flying Tigers was complicated. He claimed 6 aerial victories in China, a number that became controversial and disputed for the rest of his life. He clashed with the group's commander, Claire Chennault, repeatedly and bitterly. He drank too much. He spent money he didn't have. When the Flying Tigers were absorbed into the regular Army Air Forces in 1942, Boyington found himself back where he started, broke, without a command, and struggling to get reinstated into the Marine Corps. It took months of persistence and the intervention of sympathetic officers, but eventually the Marines took him back, and then they gave him something that would change everything. In September 1943, Boyington was given command of Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 214, a unit assembled largely from replacement pilots, men without permanent assignments, leftovers from other squadrons. Nobody expected much from them. Boyington called them the Black Sheep. What happened next became one of the most remarkable stories of the entire Pacific War. Under Boyington's command, the Black Sheep Squadron became one of the most effective fighter units in the theater. In 84 days of combat operations, they destroyed or damaged nearly 200 Japanese aircraft, sank ships, and provided close air support that ground commanders requested specifically by name. Boyington led from the front, always. He flew more missions than any pilot in his squadron. He was in the air when the fighting was hardest, in the worst weather, against the most dangerous opposition. And he could fly. Whatever demons followed Gregory Boyington on the ground, the drinking, the debts, the arguments, the poor decisions, none of them came with him into the cockpit. In the air, he was transformed. Calm, precise,
ferociously aggressive at exactly the right moments. His pilots watched him and learned things about aerial combat that no classroom could have taught them. He had a particular talent for getting Japanese pilots to fight on his terms. He would broadcast on open radio frequencies, taunting Japanese pilots over Rabaul, one of the most heavily defended Japanese bases in the Pacific, daring them to come up and fight. It was reckless, it was unprofessional. It worked. By January 1944, Boyington had 26 confirmed victories with the Marines and was closing in on Joe Foss's record of 26, the top Marine ace at the time.
On January 3, 1944, Boyington led a fighter sweep over Rabaul. It was a massive engagement, dozens of aircraft on both sides, one of the largest aerial battles over the Solomon Islands. Boyington shot down at least one Japanese aircraft, possibly more, enough to tie or break the record, depending on which account you read. And then, he was shot down himself. His P-40 was hit by Japanese fire and went into the water. His wingman saw him go down and assumed he was dead. The Marine Corps listed him as missing in action, and then, after the required waiting period, killed in action. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. Except Gregory Boyington wasn't dead. He had survived the shoot-down, pulled himself out of the water, and was picked up by a Japanese submarine. For the next 20 months, he was a prisoner of war in Japan, held in brutal conditions, subjected to interrogations, kept in camps where disease and violence were constant. He watched men die around him. He endured things he would spend the rest of his life trying not to talk about. He survived all of it. When the war ended in August 1945 and Allied forces began liberating prisoner of war camps across Japan, Gregory Boyington walked out of captivity, thinner, damaged in ways that would never fully heal, but alive. He came home to find that he had been awarded the Medal of Honor, that his Black Sheep Squadron had become famous, that people knew his name. He also came home to find that the demons he had left behind when he went to war were still waiting for him. The decades after the war were hard. The drinking never stopped. There were failed marriages, financial struggles, long stretches where the man who had once commanded one of the finest fighter squadrons in the Pacific couldn't hold a steady job. He wrote a memoir. It became a television series. A new generation discovered the Black Sheep Squadron. Gregory Boyington died in January 1988 at the age of 75. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. On his gravestone, beneath his name and his dates, are 4 words that he had chosen himself. Hell is for heroes. Number 2 on our list is probably the least famous man in this video, and that is one of the great injustices of Second World War history, because what David McCampbell accomplished on a single day in October 1944 is arguably the most extraordinary individual aerial achievement in the history of American military aviation, not of the war, of all time. David Schweier McCampbell was born on January 16, 1910 in Bessemer, Alabama. He was older than most of the pilots in this video, a fact that would become relevant later. He attended the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, graduated in 1933, and spent years as a surface warfare officer before finally transferring to naval aviation in 1938. He was 28 years old when he earned his wings, ancient by fighter pilot standards. For the first years of the war, McCampbell was largely on the sidelines. He served in administrative and training roles, watching the Pacific War unfold from a distance while younger pilots flew the combat missions. It was frustrating for a man of his temperament, precise, competitive, deeply professional. But he used the time well. He studied, he trained, he prepared. By 1943, McCampbell finally got his combat assignment. He was given command of Air Group 15, based aboard the aircraft carrier USS Essex. He was 33 years old enough to be called Gramps by some of the young pilots under his command, though none of them said it twice. What followed was one of the most devastating combat records in naval aviation history. McCampbell flew the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a big, powerful, rugged fighter specifically designed to defeat the Japanese Zero that had dominated the early Pacific War. Where the Zero was light and maneuverable, the Hellcat was heavy and fast. Where the Zero could outturn almost anything, the Hellcat could outdive and outclimb it. In the hands of a skilled pilot, the Hellcat was a killing machine. McCampbell was a very skilled pilot. His approach to aerial combat was methodical and almost scientific. He analyzed every engagement afterward with the same precision an engineer applies to a failed structure. What went wrong? What went right? What could be done better? He demanded the same analytical discipline from the pilots under his command, and the results showed in Air Group 15's combat record. But all of that, the preparation, the study, the years of waiting, was merely prologue to what happened on October 24, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. The Imperial Japanese Navy making its final, desperate attempt to destroy the American fleet and reverse the tide of the Pacific War. As part of the Japanese offensive, a massive formation of aircraft, approximately 60 planes, was detected approaching the American fleet. McCampbell took off to intercept them. He had 7 other Hellcats with him. 8 American fighters against 60 Japanese aircraft. What happened over the next few hours has been described by historians as almost beyond belief. McCampbell and his wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, separated from the rest of the flight and climbed above the Japanese formation. Then, with a precision and aggression that seemed to defy rational calculation, they attacked. McCampbell would dive on a Japanese aircraft, fire a short, precise burst, break away, climb back above the formation, and attack again, over and over and over. He was not spraying bullets, he was not charging blindly into the formation. He was working, methodically, efficiently, with the cold concentration of a man who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. The Japanese formation began to disintegrate. McCampbell kept attacking. At some point during the engagement, he ran low on ammunition. He didn't break off. He continued making passes at the Japanese formation, sometimes firing, sometimes simply diving through them to break up their cohesion, forcing them to maneuver defensively instead of pressing their attack on the fleet. When he finally returned to the Essex, his Hellcat was almost out of fuel. He had been in the air for over 2 hours. The hydraulics on his landing gear were damaged, and he had to make an emergency landing on a different carrier because the Essex's deck was occupied. The after-action report confirmed what had happened. David McCampbell had shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single mission. 9. In one sortie, one flight, one engagement. It is the highest single mission score ever recorded by an American pilot in any war. His wingman, Roy Rushing, shot down 6 more in the same engagement. Together, 2 American pilots had effectively broken up an attack by 60 Japanese aircraft. By the end of the Leyte Gulf campaign, McCampbell had 34 confirmed victories. His final total would reach 38, tied with Thomas Maguire for second place in the all-time American rankings, behind only Richard Bong. But unlike Bong and Maguire, who both died before the war ended, David McCampbell survived. He came home. He continued his naval career for years after the war, eventually retiring as a captain. He received the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt personally, the citation specifically describing the events of October 24, 1944. He lived a long, full life and died in 1996 at the age of 86. And yet, ask most Americans today if they have heard of David McCampbell. They haven't. Ask them about Bong or Maguire or Boyington. Some will recognize those names. Ask them about the pilot who shot down 9 aircraft in a single mission, the greatest single-day aerial performance in American military history. Blank stares. History is sometimes profoundly unfair in who it remembers and who it forgets. David McCampbell deserved better than history gave him. And if this video does nothing else, if you remember nothing else from the next 30 minutes, remember that name. David McCampbell, 9 kills, 1 mission, October 24th, 1944. It will never happen again.
And so we arrive at number 1. The pilot who started this video with a warning. The man who, by the numbers, doesn't belong at the top of this list. 12 aerial victories in World War II. Compared to Bong's 40, Maguire's 38, McCampbell's 38, Boyington's 28, 12 sounds almost modest. So why is Robin Olds number 1? By the end of this story, you won't need to ask. Robin Olds was born on July 14, 1922 in Honolulu, Hawaii. His father was Brigadier General Robert Olds, one of the pioneers of American strategic bombing doctrine, a man who had spent his career building the Army Air Forces into the force that would fight World War II. Robin grew up inside the military. Air bases were his backyard. Pilots were his family friends. From childhood, he absorbed the culture, the language, and the philosophy of American air power in a way that no classroom could replicate. He was also, from an early age, spectacularly difficult to ignore. Physically imposing, charismatic, funny, and possessed of a confidence that never quite crossed the line into arrogance, though it came close sometimes.
Robin Olds was the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately became the center of it. He was a star athlete at West Point, one of the finest football players the Academy had produced, good enough that the NFL came calling after graduation. He chose flying instead. He earned his wings in 1943 and was assigned to the 8th Air Force in England, flying the P-38 Lightning and later the P-51 Mustang over occupied Europe. He flew escort missions for the Great Bomber raids over Germany, the missions where American fighters had to take their charges deep into the heart of the Reich and bring them home against everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. The Luftwaffe threw a great deal. Germany's fighter pilots in 1944 were not the broken, desperate force they would become by the final months of the war. They were experienced, skilled, and flying excellent aircraft. The Me-109 and FW-190 were world-class fighters. Their pilots had been fighting since Poland, since France, since the Battle of Britain. They knew things about aerial combat that American pilots were still learning. Robin Olds learned faster than almost anyone. He had an instinctive aggression in the air that was perfectly matched by an equally instinctive tactical intelligence. He didn't just attack, he thought about how to attack, when to attack, where the enemy was vulnerable, and how to get there without being killed in the process. He scored his first aerial victory in the summer of 1944, and then kept scoring with a consistency that drew the attention of his commanders and the respect, grudging but real, of the German pilots who faced him. By the end of the war in Europe, Robin Olds had 12 confirmed aerial victories. 12. He was 22 years old, one of the leading aces of the 8th Air Force, a double ace with a distinguished combat record and a chest full of medals. And then the war ended, and Robin Olds discovered something about himself that would define the next 20 years of his life. He was not built for peacetime. The post-war military was a difficult place for combat pilots. Budgets were cut, aircraft were mothballed, the massive force that had defeated Germany and Japan was rapidly demobilized, and the men who had spent their formative years in the cockpit found themselves pushing paper, attending meetings, navigating the peacetime bureaucracy that had replaced the brutal clarity of combat. Olds navigated it badly. He was too aggressive, too outspoken, too impatient with the caution and politics of the post-war military establishment. He made enemies. His career stalled. Men who had been his subordinates in combat were promoted past him. He kept flying whenever he could. He flew everything the Air Force had: jets, experimental aircraft, anything with wings and an engine. He remained one of the finest stick and rudder pilots in the service. But stick and rudder skill wasn't what the peacetime Air Force rewarded. And then, in the mid-1960s, America went to war again: Vietnam. In 1966, Colonel Robin Olds was given command of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base, the Wolfpack. He was 44 years old. Most men his age who were still in the Air Force were behind desks. Olds was going back to combat. He grew a mustache. Not a small, regulation-compliant mustache, an enormous, extravagant, magnificently defiant handlebar mustache that violated Air Force grooming regulations in the most visible way imaginable. His superiors ordered him to shave it. He didn't. The mustache became a symbol of Olds himself, of the Wolfpack, of a particular attitude toward authority that his men found infectious and his commanders found maddening. It said without words that Robin Olds would follow the rules that mattered and ignore the ones that didn't, and he would decide which was which. In Vietnam, he was transformed. The frustration of 20 years of peacetime bureaucracy burned away the moment he started flying combat missions again. He led from the front, always, without exception. He flew more missions than any colonel in his wing had any obligation to fly. He flew as a wingman, as a flight leader, in every role, in every kind of weather, against every kind of threat. And on January 2nd, 1967, Robin Olds did something that no amount of kills or medals or records can fully capture. He planned and executed Operation Bolo. The problem Olds had identified was this: American F-105 Thunder Chiefs, the primary strike aircraft over North Vietnam, were suffering devastating losses to North Vietnamese MiG-21 fighters. The MiGs were fast, modern, Soviet-supplied, and their pilots had learned to pick their engagements carefully, attacking the heavily loaded F-105s and then disengaging before American escort fighters could respond. The MiGs were winning. Olds conceived a deception operation of extraordinary complexity. His F-4 Phantoms would fly the exact same routes, the exact same formations, the exact same radio call signs and electronic signatures as the F-105s the MiGs had been hunting. They would look, sound, and smell exactly like the aircraft the North Vietnamese had been killing with impunity. Except they wouldn't be carrying bombs. They would be carrying missiles. The North Vietnamese took the bait. MiG-21s rose to intercept what they thought was another easy strike package of bomb-laden F-105s.
They found Robin Olds and the Wolfpack waiting for them. In the engagement that followed, American fighters shot down 7 MiG-21s without a single loss.
It was the most successful American air-to-air engagement of the entire Vietnam War. In a single afternoon, Olds had fundamentally altered the air war over North Vietnam, forcing the North Vietnamese to completely rethink their tactics and ground their MiGs for weeks afterward. Olds himself shot down one of the MiGs that day, bringing his career total to 13 aerial victories across 2 wars, making him one of only a handful of American pilots to achieve ace status in both World War II and Vietnam. He could have had more. Late in his Vietnam tour, intelligence officers discovered that Olds had actually accumulated enough victories to be declared an ace in Vietnam as well, which would have made him a double ace in 2 separate wars, a distinction no American pilot has ever achieved. But several of his kills had not been officially claimed. When asked why, Olds was characteristically direct. If he became an ace in Vietnam, he would be sent home, removed from combat, turned into a symbol, a public relations asset, a face for recruitment posters. Exactly what had happened to Bong, exactly what he had watched destroy the careers of better men than himself. He had seen what happened when the Air Force decided you were too valuable to risk losing. He would rather keep flying, so the kills went unflamed. Robin Olds came home from Vietnam with a chest full of medals, a legendary reputation, and the mustache, which he finally shaved at a ceremony that became one of the most photographed moments in Air Force history, surrounded by thousands of airmen who had flown with him or wanted to. His career after Vietnam was like the years before it, a struggle against a bureaucracy that didn't quite know what to do with him. He retired as a brigadier general in 1973, 1 star, far fewer than his abilities and his record deserved, a fact that everyone in the Air Force acknowledged privately and nobody fixed. He spent his retirement years at his home in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. He gave speeches. He mentored young pilots. He remained until the end of his life one of the most sought-after voices in American aviation on the subjects of air combat, leadership, and what it actually meant to lead men into battle. He died on June 14, 2007, at the age of 84. At his funeral, the eulogies came from generals and privates alike, from men who had flown with him in Europe in 1944 and men who had flown with him over Hanoi in 1967, from people who had known him for 50 years and people who had met him once and never forgotten it. They all said variations of the same thing. There was nobody else like him. And here is why Robin Olds is number 1 on this list. Richard Bong was the greatest natural talent. Thomas Maguire was the most relentlessly driven. David McCampbell had the single greatest day any American pilot ever had in the air. Gregory Boyington was the most improbable, the most human, the most impossible to forget. But Robin Olds did something none of the others did. He kept going. When the war ended and the glory faded and the peacetime military ground down the men who had given everything, Robin Olds stayed. He absorbed 20 years of frustration and bureaucracy and passed over promotions without becoming bitter or broken or small. And when his country needed him again, when young men half his age were dying over Vietnam because nobody had figured out how to fight that air war, he went back. At 44 years old, he climbed back into a fighter cockpit, led men into combat, planned one of the most brilliant aerial deceptions in military history, and refused to come home until he had done everything he could do. He chose his men over his record. He chose the mission over the medals. He chose to keep flying over everything else the world was offering him. That is not just a great fighter pilot. That is what leadership looks like. And that is why, on a list that includes the highest scoring ace in American history, the man who shot down 9 aircraft in a single mission, and a Medal of Honor winner who survived 20 months in a Japanese prison camp, Robin Olds is number 1.
5 pilots, 5 extraordinary stories. Men who flew into the worst the Second World War could produce and refused to stop. If their stories deserve to be remembered, and they do, then share this video. Leave a comment with who you think deserves to be on this list. And subscribe, because next week we go back to the Pacific, and the battles ahead are ones you will not want to miss.